This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
Well, good evening. I'm Gleaves Whitney, the moderator of this evening's debate, and I'm the director of the Hallenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. And I want to welcome you, a warm welcome to you and also to viewers of our webcast live. Tonight's event has caused a stir because it brings together two eminent writers who happen to be brothers. Some people would have you think the only thing Peter and Christopher Hitchens share is DNA. But anybody who has read their work knows they share much more than that. Both are independent thinkers, both are fierce debaters, and both are superb writers who show a profound respect for the English language. Christopher Hitchens, the older of the two, is one of the most controversial voices in Anglo-American journalism. Based in Washington, D.C., he has written 20 books, including biographies of Thomas Paine, George Orwell, and Thomas Jefferson, with whom he shares an April 13th birthday, so early happy birthday, as well as scathing critiques of Henry Kissinger, Bill Clinton, and Mother Teresa. Most recently, he wrote the book on atheism, God is Not Great, and edited The Portable Atheist. A contributing editor to Vanity Fair, he also writes regularly for a number of high-toned publications. Peter Hitchens, the younger of the two by 2.5 years, has crossed the pond to be with us. He is one of Britain's most independent journalists who blogs and writes a regular column for the Mail on Sunday. Formerly a longtime writer for the Daily Express, Peter was once asked by former Prime Minister Tony Blair to, quote, sit down and stop being bad. This after aggressive questioning at a press conference. Peter is the author of The Abolition of Britain and The Abolition of Liberty. He has also written for The Spectator, The Guardian, and New Statesman. And it's worth noting that Peter is no stranger to our shores. He lived in Bethesda, Maryland for 2 years. Well, this event is unique. Christopher and Peter have never before debated one-on-one in the United States. I guess it's also unique because Christopher is in a church. Both brothers agreed to the topics and the format beforehand. They will debate Iraq and God principally, but this evening's format also allows considerable time at the end for you to jump in and put questions to both of our distinguished guests. The coin toss earlier this evening determined that Peter will speak first on the topic of Iraq. The brothers will debate the proposition, the invasion of Iraq was wrong. Peter, you have 10 minutes.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, that's right then. And good evening, or assalamu alaikum, as they say in Detroit. Now, in Britain, as you know, we take the adversarial principle rather further than you do. We don't just have adversarial courtrooms, we have an adversarial parliament and an adversarial press, and we have adversarial families. And I know I'm going to be asked all kinds of foolish questions about whether we got on and what our childhood was like. I would say that it had its ups and downs. My father at one point forced us in a scenario similar to that at Dayton, Ohio, to sign a peace treaty, which I later repudiated by breaking the frame open and tearing it to shreds. And we would spend long summers drenching each other with what was available to hand in those days before the super soaker, which was used washing up liquid bottles. And since then, we've really kept our hands off each other, more or less. Tonight, those of you who are hoping for a session of mud wrestling will, I hope, be disappointed. But I can offer you one small thrill, which is that it seems to me, and it seemed to me the closer I've got to this evening, that I don't ever want to do this again. So there is a very strong chance that this will be the last time we shall ever do this. Turning to the subject under discussion, the war in Iraq. I don't want to make this too easy for myself, because it seems to me that it is actually a fantastically easy position to take. First of all, I'll confess that at the beginning, for some time, my mind was not made up. I considered supporting it, and almost everything in my past made me want to do so. One of the reasons that I didn't was the rank stupidity of much of the propaganda in its favor, and I was particularly struck by an article by Michael Kinsley in which he said that the people who want this war are treating their own arguments with contempt. But one of the reasons that I would have and would have expected myself to support it is that, and this is bound to come up in the first half as well as the second half, the religion that I grew up with in England was not what you might think. The Christianity of England by that time was a pallid, anemic thing. The thing that we were all brought up to believe in was in something called "we won the war." Its saints were the pilots of the Battle of Britain. Its God was Winston Churchill. And it suffused everything we did. We lived, you must remember, in this wonderful, peaceful country, largely untouched by foreign attack, in a land honorably battered by war. I was surrounded. The cities that we lived in or near, my father was a naval officer, our father, I should say, on this evening. We lived in cities battered by war, or near cities battered by war, and everything, even as small children, that we talked about was overshadowed by that war, and we thought that it had been good. In fact, we were convinced it had been good, and we grew up entirely believing that you could, by launching war, do good things. As time has passed, and as I have traveled to the nastier places of the world, I've become less sure of this. And I've seen more and more the consequences of those pictures, which we so often see on our television screens, of the missile being launched from the ship, of what happens at the other end. And I've seen also, on a particular and terrifying occasion in Somalia, the arrival of the US Marines intent on rescuing a country in desperate straits, and the subsequent failure despite the enormous good intentions of everybody involved. But there was something else about the Iraq War that I didn't like. And that was this, and it was particularly just as it began, and as I was beginning to feel most strongly that I didn't like it, a Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, and of course I feel rather strongly about navies because of my parentage, was portrayed on the television addressing his ship's company. This was not a stirring or poetic oration. It concluded with the words, "It's hammer time," and this was succeeded by a playing of a song called "We Will Rock You." Well, yes, it is quite funny, except that what they then did was to launch missiles which headed towards a country where they would land, inevitably in some cases, on places where entirely innocent people were living. I didn't think this was a serious attitude towards war. I was reminded continuously, and I have to say I have a largely conservative audience in Britain, and I said repeatedly that I didn't like this war, and I would get angry emails, phone calls and letters saying that I was unpatriotic and wrong. And I would send back one thing to most of these people, which was Kipling's Recessional. And Admiral Keating's outburst made me think most strongly of that particular passage. We loose wild... I should have written this down, remembered it. I remembered it earlier on. Drunk with sight of power, we loose wild tongues that have not thee in awe, and of the reeking tube an iron shard upon which the heathen rely. And I thought there was an arrogance about this war, and a belief flowing from self-righteousness and misdirected idealism, which was bound to end in disaster. And I thought of my own country at the end of the 19th century embarking on the Boer War and ending, essentially, its imperial power by its overweening folly. And I thought, not merely wrong, but a mistake. And nothing, absolutely nothing which has happened since, and I have been to Iraq twice since that war took place, has convinced me in any way that I was wrong. This was an idealist war. It was an idealist war supported by idealists for the best of reasons. And it fulfilled my belief that there is nothing in this world more terrifying than somebody who thinks he is right.
Thank you, Peter. Christopher, you have 10 minutes.
And I'll take all 9.5 of them. It goes, by the way, if drunk with sight of power we loose, L-O-O-S-E, wild tongues that have not thee in awe. Such boastings as the Gentiles use, and lesser breeds without the law. It's the whole magnificence of Kipling that is exactly what makes people nervous about quoting him correctly. Because when you get it right, it's unsettling. And lots of things about this are unsettling, and so they should be. And it's my duty, as well as my pleasure, to congratulate Peter on keeping things edgy for this evening. You didn't come here, we hope, for a banal debate, ladies and gentlemen. Now listen, you can't see underneath my shirt the garlic necklace. And you have no idea that I'm fighting my way by Northwest Airlines back from here tomorrow morning to be in New York for the memorial service for William F. Buckley at St. Patrick's Cathedral. In other words, you've got no idea what I've been going through lately, and there's no real reason why you should. But when they said to me this evening, when you come out, do you want to be at the throne or at the pulpit? I did feel slightly discombobulated. And when I said, well, where's the men's room? And they said, it's down there. And there's men's room, and then there's women's room. I understand that bit. And in between, sexton's room. I began to feel more discombobulated still. And today is the anniversary of the day in 1945 when my mother and my father got married, after both of them having been through a very long war, very long, brutal, cruel war that succeeded the long austerity, poverty, struggle with which they'd had to beguile their youth in the 1920s and 30s of interwar Britain, if you can even assume that people in Europe in those days lived between two wars rather than endured a long armistice between two terrifying resumptions of hostilities. Every time you read fragile truce in the New York Times, think of that as applying to the 1920s and 1930s in Europe, and you'll get a better idea of what those resumption of hostilities were. And yes, I think if I look at my brother and think, well, our parents got married in this day, 1945, that is a little unsettling. It's also, I think, hope you don't mind my saying so, rather reassuring. We are both here, after all, and determined to testify. Now, on this question about the Mesopotamian War, everybody knows why they oppose it, don't they? Everyone's clear on what their reasons are. We were told wrong things. We were given inaccurate information by dubious governments. We were sort of cheated into a feeling that our delegations at the UN had overstated the matter of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. In fact, when you think about it, you'll find that it's probably even wrong to mention Saddam Hussein in the same breath as weapons of mass destruction or terrorism. I have a couple of tests of my own for whether people know what they're talking about when they're talking about Iraq. Anyone who says that Saddam Hussein was, okay, a bad guy, doesn't know what they're talking about. You hear that said quite a lot. They don't know. They don't know what fascism feels like. They don't know what it's like to see families forced at gunpoint to applaud the torture and execution in public of their family members. They don't know what it's like to see 180,000 members of the Kurdish people, at a minimum, killed by poison gas in the northern provinces of Iraq. They don't know what it's like to see at least that number of Shia Arabs killed in southern Iraq. They don't know what it took, Anglo-American, British-American policy, to put a no